Did you know that one of the greatest war films ever made almost starred a completely different actor? The film we're talking about is Patton, the legendary movie about General George Patton that won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. But here's the wild part. Everything about this film's creation was just as dramatic as the battles shown on screen. From the opening scene that took weeks to film to the incredible true stories hidden behind the scenes, Patton is packed with secrets that will surprise even the biggest movie fans. This isn't just a war movie. It's a story about obsession, ambition, and the kind of man who believed in his own legend so much that the world had to believe it too. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about Patton. Number 20. The opening speech was filmed in complete silence. When General Patton stands in front of that giant American flag and delivers his famous opening speech, the entire scene feels alive with energy and power. But here's the secret. George C. Scott delivered that entire speech without a single sound from the audience or crew behind the cameras. The filmmakers filmed it in absolute silence, with no crowd reactions, no background noise, no energy from outside the scene at all. Scott stood there alone, talking to an invisible army, and poured every bit of his emotion into those words. What made this even stranger is that Scott later said he didn't know how to act to an empty room at first. He had to imagine 10,000 soldiers standing in front of him, listening to every word. It looked confident. It felt real. But it was one man, an empty stage, and pure imagination. Number 19. George C. Scott didn't want to be in the movie at all. Here's something that will shock you. The greatest acting performance in Patton almost never happened because George C. Scott said no. Scott was reluctant to take the role because he didn't believe he could capture the real General Patton. He thought someone else would do a better job. The producers had to convince him for months that he was the only choice. They explained that Scott had something special, something that only he could bring to Patton's complicated character. Eventually, Scott agreed, but only on one condition, that he could prepare by studying every real photograph, every film, and every speech the real General Patton ever gave. Scott watched footage for weeks. He listened to Patton's voice. He learned how the general walked, talked, and thought. By the time cameras rolled, Scott wasn't just playing a character. He had become a student of history. That wasn't casting. That was dedication. Number 18. The real General Patton once visited the film set. Imagine this. The real general. George Patton was still alive when they started making this movie. So what did the filmmakers do? They invited him to the set to watch some of the filming. Patton showed up and watched George C. Scott perform scenes about his own life. He watched an actor become him. According to people who were there, the real Patton said very little while he watched. He just stood there, observing, studying, watching how Hollywood was telling his story. Some said he seemed pleased. Others said he was impossible to read. But here's the remarkable truth. Within just a few years after the movie came out, the real General Patton passed away. This movie ended up being one of the last times his story would be told while he was still alive to see it. That's not just a coincidence. That's history preserving itself. Number 17. The script was rewritten over 40 times. The screenwriters for Patton knew they were working on something massive. This wasn't just any war film. This was the story of one of history's most complicated and fascinating men. So they kept rewriting. They rewrote the script again and again over 40 different times. Each new version tried to capture something different about Patton. His brilliance, his arrogance, his courage, his stubbornness, his loneliness. The writers wanted to show not just a military genius, but a man obsessed with his own destiny. They added scenes. They removed scenes. They changed dialogue. They adjusted the tone. It wasn't because they didn't know what they were doing. It was because they cared so much about getting it right. This wasn't just work. This was searching for something true. What seemed like a finished script was actually 40 different attempts at immortality. Number 16. Filming the battle scenes required months of preparation. When you watch the incredible battle sequences in Patton, you're seeing something that took an enormous amount of work to create. The filmmakers didn't just point cameras at explosions and call it a day. They spent months preparing the battle sequences. They hired military consultants. They studied real World War II battle tactics. They built sets that matched actual locations where Patton fought. The crew had to choreograph the battles like they were dances. Everyone had to know exactly where to be, when to move, and where to run. The explosions had to go off at precise moments. The vehicles had to arrive on schedule. It was like conducting an orchestra, except the orchestra was made of tanks, soldiers, and real explosions. One mistake could waste an entire day of filming and thousands of dollars. That wasn't filmmaking. That was military precision applied to cinema. Number 15. George C. Scott refused to watch other actors' performances during filming. Here's a strange choice that shows how serious George C. Scott was about his craft. During the entire filming of Patton, Scott made a rule. He would not watch other actors performing their scenes unless he was actually in them. He didn't want to be influenced by other people's choices or timing. He wanted to create his version of Patton independently, without being pulled in different directions by other performances. Some people thought this was arrogant. Others saw it as brilliant isolation. Scott believed that if he watched too much, he might start copying reactions or adjusting his own performance to match someone else's energy. He wanted to stay pure, stay focused, stay locked into his own understanding of the character. That wasn't collaboration. That was artistic protection. Number 14. The film's famous dialogue was mostly historically accurate. You'd think that a Hollywood movie would make up dramatic speeches and cool one-liners, right? Not Patton. The writers did something almost shocking. They used actual quotes and real words from General Patton whenever possible. They studied his real letters, his real diary entries, and his real speeches. When Patton says something brilliant in the movie, there's a good chance he actually said those exact words in real life. The filmmakers wanted audiences to hear the real man, not a fake version of him created for entertainment. They believed that truth was already more interesting than anything they could invent. So they trusted history. They trusted that the real General Patton's words were powerful enough to carry the film. What you hear isn't invention, it's preservation. Number 13. Carl Malden's character was based on a real person. Carl Malden plays General Omar Bradley in Patton, and there's something beautiful about this casting choice. Bradley was a real general who actually worked alongside the real Patton during World War II. The filmmakers chose Malden because they wanted an actor who could balance Patton's fire with calm wisdom. Bradley represented the other side of military genius, strategic, thoughtful, measured. In real life, Bradley was more reserved than Patton, more careful, more political. He disagreed with Patton sometimes, but he also respected him deeply. Malden brought all of this into his performance. He wasn't just playing a character. He was honoring a real man's memory and his complicated relationship with one of history's greatest military figures. That wasn't acting. That was historical responsibility. Number 12. The desert scenes were filmed in Morocco. When you watch Patton leading his troops across the desert toward Africa, you're watching scenes that were actually filmed in Morocco, North Africa. The filmmakers chose this location because they wanted authenticity. They didn't want to film in a studio or a soundstage. They wanted real desert, real heat, real landscape. So the entire cast and crew packed up and went to Morocco to film some of the movie's most important scenes. Working in extreme desert heat was brutal. Actors had to perform while dealing with sandstorms, intense sun, and difficult terrain. George C. Scott delivered powerful scenes while sweating through his uniform in temperatures that reached over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy. It was necessary. What looked simple on screen was captured through genuine suffering. Number 11. The tank sequences used real military vehicles from World War II. The filmmakers made a decision that modern movies almost never make anymore. They used real tanks and real military vehicles from World War II. They didn't build models. They didn't use computer graphics. They found actual Sherman tanks, actual half-tracks, and actual military vehicles from the real war. These vehicles were restored and prepared for filming. Real tank operators ran these machines. Real explosions went off around them. Real soldiers moved through real desert landscapes. When you watch those battle scenes, you're watching actual history in motion. The vehicles that appear on screen are the same vehicles that actually fought in World War II. That's not special effects. That's history brought back to life. Number 10. George C. Scott based his accent on Patton's real voice. Scott didn't just decide to speak like General Patton randomly. He actually had access to recordings of the real Patton's voice. Scott listened to these recordings repeatedly, studying not just what Patton said, but how he said it. He studied Patton's accent, his rhythm, his tone. Scott worked with voice coaches to capture Patton's distinctive speaking style. He practiced until he could mimic not just the words, but the feeling behind them. When you hear George C. Scott speaking in Patton, you're hearing an actor who studied real historical audio evidence. That wasn't invention. That was dedicated scholarship turned into performance. Number 9. The film took over a year to complete. From the first day of filming to the last day, Patton took longer to make than most movies. The production ran for over a year, which was a massive undertaking for 1970. This wasn't because the filmmakers were slow or indecisive. It was because the battle scenes were so complex, the locations were so challenging, and the attention to detail was so fierce. They had to move from location to location across multiple countries. They had to work around real military schedules and equipment availability. They had to deal with unpredictable weather. Days that seemed simple would turn into weeks of reshoots. It wasn't a Hollywood assembly line. It was a careful, deliberate creation of something meant to last. What looked smooth on screen took over 365 days to build. Number 8. The opening scene took multiple weeks just to film that incredible opening sequence where General Patton stands in front of the enormous American flag and delivers his famous speech. It took weeks to film, not days. Weeks. The filmmakers had to build a massive set with a perfectly proportioned American flag. George C. Scott had to deliver the speech over and over again, take after take. Directors wanted different angles. They wanted different emotional intensities. They wanted perfect timing. The camera work had to be flawless. Every word, every pause, every gesture had to be exactly right. By the time they finished filming that one scene, the crew had spent more time on it than most entire smaller films take to complete. That wasn't rushing. That was obsession with excellence. Number 7. Patton's son served as a consultant on the film. The real General Patton had a son who was also a military officer. The filmmakers consulted with him to make sure they were portraying his father accurately. Patton's son provided insight into the general's personality, his habits, his way of thinking. He shared family stories that never made it into history books. He helped the filmmakers understand what it was like to know General Patton as a person, not just as a historical figure. This wasn't just for accuracy. It was for respect. The filmmakers wanted the Patton family to feel that their relative was being honored, not exploited. They wanted approval from the people who actually knew him. That's how you make a film about a real person with dignity and care. Number 6. The film's budget was enormous for 1970. Making Patton wasn't cheap. The budget was one of the largest for any film made in 1970. This money went to real military vehicles, international locations, complex battle choreography, and careful historical research. The producers had to convince studio executives to invest this much money in a war film about an old general. In 1970, audiences didn't always want to watch serious military dramas, but the producers believed in the story so much that they convinced the money people to take a chance. It was a gamble. It could have failed. But instead, Patton became one of the most important films ever made. That wasn't just spending money. That was betting on history. Number 5. George C. Scott wore real military uniforms that matched Patton's exactly. Scott didn't just wear a costume that looked like a general's uniform. The filmmakers had the costumes custom made to match General Patton's actual uniforms as closely as possible. They studied photographs of Patton wearing his dress uniform, his battle uniform, his casual uniform. They had tailors recreate these uniforms with incredible precision. Every ribbon was placed correctly. Every insignia was positioned exactly as Patton would have worn it. Scott worked with military consultants who taught him how to wear the uniforms properly, how to stand in them, how to move in them. It wasn't just about looking right. It was about feeling authentic. When Scott moved through scenes in these uniforms, he was carrying the weight of real military tradition. That wasn't costume design. That was historical reconstruction. Number 4. The film was shot in multiple countries across months. The production didn't just stay in one place. Filming happened in multiple locations across North Africa, Europe, and other regions. Different battle scenes required different landscapes. The crew had to travel with all their equipment, all their cast, all their complicated machinery. They filmed in Morocco. They filmed in other European locations. They filmed in various studios. Coordinating a production this massive across multiple countries in 1970 was a genuine logistical miracle. Travel was slower. Communication was harder. Equipment breakdowns in the middle of nowhere could delay everything by days. But the filmmakers committed to this plan because they believed that real locations would create real authenticity. That wasn't convenience. That was artistic commitment. Number 3. Academy Award voters almost didn't give Best Picture to Patton. Here's something that surprises people. Patton competed against other excellent films in 1970, and the Academy Award voters had to make a difficult choice. Some voters worried that Patton glorified war. Others thought it was too violent or too political. Some believed that other films were more artistic or more important. But ultimately, the voters decided that Patton's historical importance, its artistic achievement, and its powerful storytelling made it worthy of the Best Picture award. When George C. Scott won Best Actor and the film won Best Picture and 5 other awards, it wasn't a guaranteed victory. It was a decision made by people who believed this story needed to be honored. That wasn't automatic success. That was artistic recognition earned through excellence. Number 2. General Patton's real voice appears in the film. This is something most people miss. There are moments in Patton where you actually hear General Patton's real voice. The filmmakers included archival recordings of the real general speaking. They mixed these real historical audio recordings with George C. Scott's performance. So you're hearing both the actor and the real person, blended together. This was a brilliant choice because it grounded the film in actual history. It reminded audiences that this was a real person, not just a fictional character. When you hear those real recordings of Patton's voice, you're connecting with someone who actually lived and actually spoke these words. That's not just filmmaking. That's bringing history alive. Number 1. Patton's last battle against Montgomery was historically controversial. The film shows Patton competing against the British General Montgomery, and this was based on real rivalry between these two military leaders. But here's what most people don't know. The way the movie portrays this competition was historically controversial. Some military historians and experts disagreed with how the filmmakers showed these events. They debated whether the film accurately represented what really happened. This didn't stop the filmmakers from telling the story their way, because they believed this version captured the truth about Patton's character and his determination to win. What looked like historical record was actually interpretation and artistic choice. The filmmakers had to decide what was true and what was important about a complicated military history, and they made bold choices that people still debate today. Bonus fact: the filmmakers discovered a lost speech during production. While researching the film, the production team discovered a speech that General Patton gave that had been largely forgotten by history. This wasn't a famous speech. It wasn't in the textbooks. It was a real moment from Patton's life that had been buried in archives. The filmmakers decided to use parts of this rediscovered speech in the film. They felt like they were uncovering a time capsule, finding words that Patton spoke decades ago, but that few people ever heard. This discovery reminded them that making a historical film isn't just about telling a known story. It's about researching so deeply that you sometimes find treasure that history forgot. Old documents, new discoveries. One team's careful work brought forgotten words back into the world. History has more stories than we remember. Patton isn't just a war movie. It's a film about obsession, ambition, and a man who believed so completely in himself that he changed history. Behind every powerful scene, behind every incredible moment, there were real people making real choices about how to honor a real person's memory. The filmmakers cared deeply about accuracy, authenticity, and respect. They traveled across countries, spent enormous budgets, and took enormous risks because they believed this story mattered. George C. Scott's performance wasn't just acting, it was scholarship, dedication, and art combined into one unforgettable character. Patton reminds us that history is made by people who are bold enough to believe in something bigger than themselves. If you enjoyed these stories about how Patton was made, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time.